Um, this tape occurs on the conjunction of Trump being sworn in for a second term of office during the onset of the Peace of Gaza, the ceasefire agreement, and also on Martin Luther King national holiday. So it's an ironic set of circumstances. And irony does create what Martin Luther King referred to as creative tension. It creates creative tension. And in the course of this creative tension, I had some thoughts that I would like to share. The first Atlanta Compromise set the stage for one of the most well-known differences of opinion in African American heritage. There are several well-known or fairly well-known differences of opinion. The most well-known of them all is the difference between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King regarding militancy, self-defense, and nonviolence. The Atlanta Compromise is a very important piece of work. The Atlanta Compromise was when Booker T. Washington made the case for the Tuskegee Institute. I'd give you an explanation that would probably help you understand and support what he was driving. If you look at segregated schools, you might be forgiven to hope that Black children went to schools with Black teachers where they would likely to be encouraged and treated fairly, rather than to formerly segregated schools where they were subject to racism. And thus, of course, you were looking at the big picture, which was to change the circumstances of the law and the dimension of grading fairness to bring about an end to racism in public education. And so the difference of opinion that occurred with the Atlanta Compromise was with a group called the Niagara Movement, who went to Niagara Falls to get away from Booker T. Washington's observers. And they became the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. And they had a very practical, legal, and permanent commitment to bringing about an end of segregation. When they looked at Booker Washington, they saw his compromises as legitimizing the racism of Woodrow Wilson and the robber barons. And a number of struggles were emerging at the time between non-unionized Black labor, who Henry Ford encouraged, and A. Philip Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Other fairly well-known differences of opinion in the Black community include the question of the literature in the Harlem Renaissance. Richard Wright is quite a writer. It's very hard to appreciate just how incredible he is unless you encounter him by reading his work. And Zora Neale Hurston was disdained somewhat by her friend, Richard Wright, for what he saw as caricatures, when in reality she was creating masterpieces of linguistic study of language, you can appreciate the issue that arises similarly by looking at Gaza, or a similar difference of opinion that arose later between Roy Wilkins, who was in the suit and tie gentry of the NAACP in New York, the aristocracy of talent that led the way through the courts with Thurgood Marshall, and Fannie Lou Hamer, who was a cotton dress sharecropper's daughter, who didn't have a great deal of education or command of the English language. And Roy Wilkins was disdainful of her, wrongly, because like Zora Neale Hurston and the people in Gaza, Bazan spoke this quite clearly this morning in her daily broadcast. Zora Neale Hurston and Fannie Lou Hamer established their pride of place on pride of place. What you need to understand is, I'm getting to the crux of what my talk is about, that many anonymous, overlooked people contributed a great deal and made a very good accounting of themselves, particularly among women in the civil rights movement. So what I see is a situation where Black people have in some ways done more to secure the safety of our country and our government than even they understand that they have done. And the reason for this is in some of these differences of opinion, there's a tendency to cast one side or the other as right and the other side as wrong. When you look at Stokely Carmichael and John Lewis as leaders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, you're dealing with two just very different people. One is not right and the other is not wrong. They're just different. And as Sundiata, a professor of mine, said, Booker T. Washington was a very perceptive man. There's a tendency to make him look like an Uncle Tom. But ironically, his foundation and legacy in some ways is the foundation and legacy of the hero of the story of the Second Atlanta Compromise, which is Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson was one of these magnanimous people who protected the shires of the United States by his achievements and his clarity in ways that remind me of Tolkien's fabled address of the scorn of the Dunedain by the hobbits. They call us names like Strider, said Aragorn with a laugh. He said, as long as they're safe and happy, I can sleep. And in the movie, you see him throwing open the doors of Gondor after a tremendous struggle. When you see Paul Robeson, starry-eyed and handsome, looking ever so slightly like the stereotypes that he broke by his achievements, you're seeing a man of tremendous power, one of the furies of American society, throwing open the doors of Gondor as he walks down a stairwell, laughing lightly. Why is this the case, and what is the Second Atlantic Compromise? The reason this is the case is that the pragmatism and the practical factors of stopping lynch mobs, prosecuting killers, criminalizing sadism in the police department, mandating quotas for fair hiring practices, and preventing unfair treatment of children in schools is all part of the achievement that's practical and direct easily assessed and judged as a result of the efforts of groups like the NAACP and Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the United Negro College Fund. But something else was happening in the crowd that Booker T. Washington made his compromise with. It was something that was insidious and vicious and almost noticed only by the superstitious, and it was the Faustian relationship of Hollywood's mogul system with the great dictators in the Axis, D.W. Griffith's appalling partnership with Mussolini, by which the defeated from the Civil War reasserted their power after the Civil War, and then did it again after World War II. This arc of the creation of Hollywood, from The Birth of the Nation, which was a racist film glorifying the rise of the KKK, to the Red Scare, were the same little group of men, and Paul Robeson was in there with them, all alone, breaking the color barrier. And when he was subject to the Inquisition of the House Un-American Affairs Activities Committee, even Eleanor Roosevelt, who should have known better, shunned him for his honesty and assessment as an experienced man. He didn't compromise with them. And yet his foundation, in some ways, comes from Booker T. Washington's injunction: cast down your buckets where you are. He cast down his bucket in Hollywood. The compromise that was made in the 80s with Reagan was one that ignored the foundation of his fascism in the racism of D.W. Griffith, even though his films, full of Axis symbolism, were made by Raoul Walsh, the assistant director of D.W. Griffith in Birth of the Nation. The NAACP made a compromise for Obama based on the Pussy Ball war game that was clocked to the AIDS attack. This second Atlanta compromise has Paul Robeson among all the people who have lived in America to thank that I was able to bring out the evidence for this. It was Paul Robeson whose life spanned the death of Frederick Douglass to the achievements of Martin Luther King. And he alone broke the stereotype of compromise in Hollywood, which means that the Atlanta Compromise paradoxically gave birth and foundation to the refusal to compromise. When Paul Robeson was questioned by the Red Scare Inquisition, he told it like it was.